All right, everybody. Wrist up. Wake the guy up in the back so he can raise his wrist. You got anything on there? Yeah. It's that morning for me too. All right, folks, pull your mask up and let's get underway. Last time we finally made it to the United States. We spent an exhausting amount of time covering a very short period. Why? Because it was extremely important. What period in U.S. history was the only time that the government specifically sponsored theater? Okay, but what was that period? Well, it would be the in-between years. But what was it? Well, that was what was sponsoring it. What period of U.S. history did the United States specifically fund theater? They were also funding writers, visual artists. It was the Great Depression. You know, it was during the Great Depression that the U.S. government started ponying up money for everything at this period. And so it is during the Great Depression that we start throwing money toward the arts. Now, money did go toward the arts, a very small amount, but very significant for our country to do so. Most money went toward building, agriculture, everything possible to keep people working. Now, these were all parts of reforms by the president at the time, Franklin Delano Roosevelt. These reforms were called what? This is standard U.S. history. The New Deal. The idea behind the New Deal is that when the country was founded, an agreement was made between the citizens and the government. This is how we're going to run things. Everybody said, okay, that's fine. But, nobody was prepared for a global economic depression. When the depression hit, all the things we had set up did not function against it. And so FDR came up with what he called the New Deal. Basically now the government's going to assume this, this, and this, and the citizens of this country will now do this, this, and this. And that New Deal is still with us today, and the fact that we still have Social Security, the fact that we still have unemployment, insurance, the fact that we still have all these programs, those were all New Deal programs. Now, under the New Deal, one section of it, their entire responsibility was creating jobs. Creating jobs. What was this part? As I said, this has been covered. It's under the, this is what's over that. The WPA. The WPA, the Works Progress Administration. Works Progress Administration basically was told, here's a checkbook, start jobs. Find things that you can pay people for. And among them was the Federal Theater Project. And so the Federal Theater Project is under the WPA. But then again, building post offices, courthouses, and roads in the middle of nowhere, that's all under the WPA also. The Federal Theater Project is only going to last about 4 years. But it's going to have a significant impact and employs a lot of people who continue working in theater after. It lays the ground roots for theater all over this country, places that had never seen theater before. But after 4 years, it found itself, continually under pressure, and finally was abolished. Now, one of the big reasons that it was abolished was because many people felt that the art it was creating was being used for political means, which is a fancy way of saying propaganda. Many people felt the Federal Theater Project and the Federal Art Project and all the other programs that were designed like that gave far too much power to whatever administration was sitting in the White House. FDR, he didn't like the way the Supreme Court was deciding cases. Next minute, the Federal Theater Project is doing shows about the Supreme Court. Art's being produced against it. They wanted to put up dams. It was going to change the whole landscape. Next minute, we're making films and showing them everywhere about how these dams are a good idea. And so it was decided that this was far too dangerous for any party to actually have control over. And so Congress abandons it. It has its funding pulled. Now, there were other reasons behind this too. The South constantly threw a fit over the fact the Federal Theater Project refused to segregate. And so they had major issues there. Out west, they had issues with migrant labor working with it. And so, there were a lot of things that just kept putting them in the crosshairs until finally Congress pulled the trigger after 4 years. But in those 4 years, a lot of people were employed that otherwise wouldn't have found a living. Now, among those employed were some of the big names that we have in literature and theater that are going to precede the next generation, one of which we covered. He's considered to have written the Great American Play about the disillusion of the American dream, the failings of the American dream. He was employed by the Federal Theater Project. Arthur Miller. What is considered Miller's great work? Death of a Salesman, thank you. Death of a Salesman is considered Miller's masterwork. Now, The Crucible, many people point at as one of the great American plays also. View from the Bridge, All My Sons. These are all good plays, but Death of a Salesman is his play that everybody looks at and refers to as that great American play. But Miller, when he got out of the University of Michigan, there was no work. The Depression was still going really strong, and so he actually found, employment with the Federal Theater Project. It was a big deal at that time. Who is America's most awarded playwright? Eugene O'Neill. Eugene O'Neill is our most awarded playwright. He is the only playwright in U.S. history to have what global literary award? They've actually been handing out that award this week. The Nobel Prize. And so the Nobel Prize in Literature, he is the only U.S. playwright to have one, along with 4 Pulitzers, which is one more than any other playwright that we start listing. In fact, there's only 2 with 3. So he's got a pretty safe lead considering the other 2 are also dead. And so Eugene O'Neill is our most awarded playwright. This is a man who could write in any genre, it seems. You know, he constantly changed up things. But it is near the end of his life that he created what many people consider to be his masterpiece, and that is Long Day's Journey into Night. Long Day's Journey into Night is O'Neill's masterpiece, the one that everybody turns to. It is autobiographical. It was not performed until after his death. It won the Pulitzer in '56. But it is that play that just hangs on there. And then there was only one playwright that was from the South. Tennessee Williams. Tennessee Williams, you know, guy could name plays, you know, Night of the Iguana, you know, great play, Rose Tattoo, Summer and Smoke, Sweet Bird of Youth. Cat on a Hot Tin Roof won him his 2nd Pulitzer, but it's his 1st Pulitzer that everybody always looks at, and that one was for don't worry, it can be a 2-person conversation. Streetcar Named Desire. Streetcar Named Desire is considered Williams's masterpiece. Now, he also wrote The Glass Menagerie. And The Glass Menagerie, just like The Crucible, is considered to be one of the great American plays. But that said, Streetcar still stands as, you know, his high point. Glass Menagerie is just, half a step behind, if that much. And so that leaves us one more, and that last playwright is the 2nd most awarded playwright in U.S. history. He does not have a Nobel Prize, but he does have 3 Pulitzers. But when asked, he always said he had 3.5. And that gives us Edward Albee. Now, what play did he always say he had half a Pulitzer for? Who's Afraid of Virginia Woolf, remember, was denied the Pulitzer after the body in charge of it voted for it to get it. But the people in charge of the money and the award itself said, no, this play is too obscene. We're not going to give it any of this stuff. And so it was denied the Pulitzer in 1963. But it is considered to be his greatest work, even though he has awards for everything else. In fact, Who's Afraid of Virginia Woolf did win, all the performance awards that year. So as actual production, it did get recognized. But the writer itself was constantly denied at that time. Albee only passed away about 3 years ago. But he was still active all the way into that point. He and O'Neill are an exception to the rule because their work spans decades. They have a running, go of about 40 years of successful plays, whereas Miller and Williams, their careers are really a 10-year period. Now, Miller's career, you could argue, possibly could have been a longer career, but it got derailed when he got called before what committee? HUAC, for short. HUAC. And why did HUAC want to talk to him? Spent a lot of time on it, folks. Possibly destroyed a man's career. Actually, it destroyed several people's careers. At least Miller could continue to write plays in the theater. He wasn't just in movies. They were trying to see if he was a communist. He actually had never been a member of the Communist Party. He knew communists because during World War II, the communists were our allies. And so, people who were communists, they weren't the enemy. But after World War II, we then entered the Red Scare. And that period, communism became the big frightful thing we had to watch out for. And Miller, though he was not a communist, they wanted to know who he knew that were communists. And it's a very good chance he would have went to jail, or at least, been starved out of being successful, had he not been married to the wealthiest actor in Hollywood at the time, Marilyn Monroe. And so those are your four big names in American playwriting. Those are the names that get brought up all the time. Those are the names that you're going to see no matter where you go to in the world. Those plays are going to be performed. Last time we started with the Federal Theater Project, which, as I keep harping on, is the only time the government has actually sponsored theater in the United States. Well, today, as we left off last time, I said we were going to cover the most popular form of theater that this country is known for. And that form is no, and during the 19th century, I would argue we were really good at it. But I would say this is a style of theater that evolves partially from melodrama, but it is still the most profitable form of theater in this country today. You fooled me. I thought you had an answer there. Now pull your mask up. Whenever you see a commercial for the Fox Theater in Atlanta, they're not advertising Death of a Salesman. They're not advertising Long Day's Journey into the Night. So what is this theatrical form that we are mainly known for today? In fact, we're considered pioneers in this country. In fact, when you came in, there was a slide up that basically had the answer yelling at everybody in here. No, that could be anything. Who in here has paid to see a professional show or had a school pay for a professional show for them to go see? Okay, so 2, which actually is, 3. Still on average, for an American audience. What was the show? So you're saying it was so long ago, all those 3 years. What? It'd be great to have the police get a sketch from you. So what did you see? This had an ear, more like a Picasso. What we are mainly known for in this country, ladies and gentlemen, is what is on Broadway and what dominates Broadway today. America is known for its musicals. That's what we get to hang our hats on. Musicals are also the most profitable and the most expensive style of theater to produce. If you want to put one on stage, it costs a small fortune to get one going. But these are the shows that dominate. Now, all the individuals I named before, Albee, Miller, O'Neill, none of them wrote musicals. But their shows had to compete with musicals. These individuals had to be great playwrights, otherwise their shows wouldn't have lasted that long, because musicals will last a long time. For a play to be performed more than a year today is unheard of. But for a musical to run more than a year, well, that's a success. And we have some musicals in this country that have been running since, well, actually we have one that's been running since 1988. And you can continue to see it today by going to Broadway. Why is it still playing? Because it keeps selling out. When it no longer sells out, it'll go away. We no longer have anything subsidizing theater, so the moment something's unprofitable, it disappears. But as long as ticket sales keep going in that direction, they'll run the show. That show will stay going for a long time. Everything up here right now is a musical, and they dominate. They dominate the U.S., and when you talk about American theater in other parts of the world, quickly, after you get past, what's considered to be the great drama, instantly it'll turn toward musicals. Musicals are the big conversation people are going to have about us. The musical, we did not create. The musical is not a creation of the United States. The musical has a history, the Greeks were playing music during their plays, and had dance in their shows. And so this has been part of the theater since the beginning. What the musical really does in the United States is that we take it and we made it into something bigger. The musical that we have really comes out of a British tradition, and that British tradition is called the musical comedy. The musical comedy. And it has its base in what was called English music hall. In America, we had vaudeville, but in Britain, they had what they called music hall. And so what this was independent musical pieces separated by variety acts. So what does that mean? Well, show starts, and there's this huge song and dance number. That number ends, and then a dog act comes on, a juggler comes on, an acrobat comes on, a stand-up comedian comes on, people who do a little comedic scene that lasts like 4 minutes. Now, why are they having this? Because all those people who are in the song and dance number are backstage right now, changing costumes, getting ready for the next number. And so this part breaks it up. That little act in between ends, and then the next big music number comes on. And so you have another big dance and music number. That comes to an end, that goes off, and then a different act comes on. The music numbers had nothing in common with each other. From one dance to the next, it was just how big of a costume can we get on? How flashy can we make this? And the variety acts, of course, had nothing to do with each other. It had to do with the fact that, okay, these are the people who are touring through right now, so we've got a juggler here, and we'll put the other juggler later, that way they're not too close. We have one dog act, we have an acrobat, we have a tap dance number that we can stick in here, the guy's traveling. And so they had nothing to do with each other. But then you would go and you would see, song and dance, variety act, song and dance, variety act, song and dance, variety act. And that's how you got through the evening with it. We changed that. And we changed that in 1927 with Showboat. Showboat is the first musical, really, that looks like a musical, that we're building up for today. Now, 2 names I want you to know out of this, Oscar Hammerstein and Jerome Kern. Those were the 2 individuals responsible for this one. So what made Showboat different than what came before it? Well, Showboat was highly controversial when it came out as a piece of art. Today it's more controversial because of the content of what made it. But at the time, it was controversial because it took so much effort to stage it. And the reason is, what Kern and Hammerstein did was they created a show in which all the songs had a common theme. And they replaced the variety acts that used to go in between all these numbers with scenes from plays. And so before you knew it, you were creating a show that had a narrative. That's what America did to the musical form. We put a story to it. It was no longer just, song and dance, jugglers, song and dance tap numbers, song and dance dog, song and dance knife throw or fire eater, whatever you have it. Instead, it became song and dance. Here's the story of why we're here. Song and dance to tell that story further. Narrative to set up the next part. And so that's really what we did. Unlike, drama, in which the playwright is considered to be, here's our starting point. This is the main person responsible for this happening. In a musical, the two most important figures are the lyricist and the composer. Those are the two people who get advertised. And so when we look over here, Oscar Hammerstein, he's a lyricist. Jerome Kern, he's the composer. A lyricist, of course, does what? It's given away in the title itself, lyric, a lyricist. What? He writes the songs. He comes up with the songs. The composer, of course, just like any composer, he writes the music. And so the songwriter and the music writer are the two big roles. The person who writes the story generally doesn't get top billing in a musical. These narrative musicals are called book musicals. And in fact, when you're grabbing a script for a musical, it's no longer called a script, it's called the book. And so a book musical is a musical that has a story. What we call a musical today is from the book musical. And so these two individuals in 1927 opened Showboat. And Showboat, even the producer at the time, Ziegfeld, he was so worried he was going to lose everything on this show. Highly successful producer, knew these guys were really good, wanted them to create something, came in and was freaked out because it was not what he expected. He was expecting what they had always done. It would have, big costume number followed by, something, and then big costume number again followed by something else. And so he got real worried about it because when he went into rehearsals, he saw them telling a story. And he was worried, well, what if people aren't interested in this story? What if people, are offended by this story? What happens of this? What happens of this? There's too much risk in it. If you went to a musical comedy and you didn't like the opening, well, don't worry. The next piece has nothing to do with it. Maybe you'll like that. And so if you didn't like something, well, the next act coming on could turn it around. With a musical, everything's tied together. And so he was convinced that, something's going to go wrong and they're never going to enjoy it. Well, Ziegfeld may have not been wrong with a lot of things concerning business, but for the rest of his career, he tried to recapture what he had with Showboat because it was so successful. And one of the reasons that Showboat was so successful is that it was not light. It was not something that was just purely enjoyable that you could kick your feet up for and enjoy. Showboat deals with miscegenation. I know, big academic word. Actually, you find it on a lot of legal documents throughout this country. Anybody can tell me what miscegenation is? Miscegenation is the fancy legal term for the mixing of the races. Showboat, when a boat was on water, it was considered basically to be international waters for the most part. And showboats were the cruise lines of their period. You'd get on the boat in St. Louis. Once it left dock in St. Louis, it was no longer under Missouri law, and it wasn't under any state laws until it finally docked at another place. And so on the water, that's why you could gamble on showboats. They weren't part of the state. And then because of the amount of gambling on a showboat, they had put in theaters and everything else to entertain people, to keep people happy on them. Well, the boat is stopped in a location, and the authorities come on board and are told, that there is a relationship that is illegal on the boat. And since it's docked, it's under the laws of the state, and so they began questioning people, trying to find, this couple on the boat. And so it is not a light story, especially for 1927. And so this really captured a lot of people's imagination. A lot of people didn't like it. A lot of people looked at it and said, well, this is, not what the musical was made for. This is not the direction it should be going. It's meant to be light. It's meant to be something that people just enjoy. You don't have to think about. But a lot of people saw it and were really moved by what happened. Now, it is not in any way, shape, or form, this wonderful show. It was very early. And so they're trying to mix, the drama with the music. Sometimes it's really, jagged. It doesn't run smoothly from one scene to the next. It was an experiment in many ways. And plus, in 1927, for lack of a better way to put it, there were a lot more things that people were tolerant of. And so if you tried to stage this show today, people have heart attacks over it. In fact, the Broadway revival, a lot of the language was changed in the 1990s because, it no longer fits our sensibilities of what it was trying to accomplish. It was trying to do things that today, when we look at it, it's like, and that's how you did it? Oh, man. And so it is the first in 1927, but it is not, it's the first turning point. It gets us away from this, and after that, everybody is trying to create this book musical. Nobody really gets it, though, until 1943. In 1943, Richard Rodgers and Oscar Hammerstein, same Oscar Hammerstein from Showboat, they team up and they create Oklahoma. Oklahoma is considered to be the first musical to really integrate music, acting, and dance. This, from 1927 to 1943, Oscar Hammerstein had been working on trying to make this flow. As successful as Showboat was, it was still an experimental show. Well, Oklahoma is no longer an experiment. Oklahoma is basically hanging the flag out there and saying, this is how you can do this. And it broke a lot of the conventions, Showboat and the big musical numbers that always started off shows. This starts with just a solo tenor. It doesn't do any of the things that people expected out of a musical. It came out in the midst of us at war. We had just started fighting in World War II a year before. And, the country was looking for something it could, see as different, something that was uplifting compared to many other things. And Oklahoma was it. And yes, it is, as I said, uplifting, but at the same time, it has a hard edge. It has a ballet sequence nightmare in the middle that people still talk about as one of the most horrific scenes in theater. It's a mean piece. But it was that musical that finally put it all together. And I would argue that the musicals we see today, they start having their story under Showboat, but they start having that smoothness, that slick presentation after Oklahoma. Oklahoma is the first one that puts it together where it starts to function. This is where it really starts to work. And so musicals become the dominant form in America. When we take a look up here, all of those shows have a significant impact, on the U.S. and British public in the English-speaking world. Some of them are continuing the show. Some of them innovated, as far as morality on stage. Some of them innovated technology on stage, but all of them had an impact. And that's really where musicals, are the changing force in theater today. Now, where do we go to see musicals in this country? Broadway. That's where we go to see theater in this country. The fact is that, anything that has ever survived to be talked about like years later had to make it to New York. And overseas, it has to make it to West End. Those are the two places that are going to be the big draws. On West End, the big man was this guy, Andrew Lloyd Webber. Andrew Lloyd Webber is a composer and a lyricist. The shows he creates, he does both for. In fact, he's responsible for the longest running show in Broadway history. That show is Phantom of the Opera. It continues to run today. You can still buy tickets and go see it, but Lloyd Webber is the creator of it. He is British. All of his shows originally opened up over in Britain on the West End, but they did migrate over and make it to America and continued to be successful. But, Cats, Phantom of the Opera, Joseph Amazing Technicolor Dreamcoat, Evita, Jesus Christ Superstar, all of these were hits. The guy actually racked them in. Then on our side, we have Stephen Sondheim. Stephen Sondheim is also a lyricist and composer. And so he racks them up also, shows like Company, Sweeney Todd, West Side Story, Follies. He's the individual for our side of the ocean that has hit after hit. His stuff generally opens in the United States, but it makes it over to the West End and it runs. But the gold standard are these two. And we've already talked about their greatest collaboration, and that was Oklahoma. But Rodgers and Hammerstein are that golden age of the musical. They're the guys who are going to bring it into focus. Between 1943 and I'd probably say the early 60s, these guys just made bank. Every other year they had a show open and they were just going to make a fortune with it. Even what was considered slight misses, as far as their shows, were still highly successful financially. Oklahoma, Flower Drum Song, Cinderella, Carousel, highly controversial musical, but makes it. The King and I, South Pacific, The Sound of Music, which was their last show before Oscar Hammerstein passed away of cancer. Their teaming up really is what set the standard for the American musical. Because every one of these, one of the great things about their work, like I said, Oklahoma has that nightmare sequence that people still, talk about as one of the most horrific. South Pacific, it's a musical about racism in the islands during World War II. U.S. soldiers are landing there and trying to live among people who, are like, why are you here? And, it has a great song in it, You Learn to Hate. And it does not go over well. In fact, in television broadcasts, there were constant arguments about not having that song included. But Rodgers and Hammerstein said, you take out that song, you take out the entire show. King and I, Western woman ends up teaching in Asia. Once again, it's one of those shows where she's trying to adapt to a different culture. Carousel came out after the war, highly controversial musical. Opens up in heaven where we find out the protagonist died trying to break up a robbery that he had started. He fell on his knife. He's told by St. Peter his kid's down there having trouble. He wants to go back down there and try and fix it. It's got some mean edge to it. Ends up beating up his daughter when he gets back down there. Just not exactly the wholesome thing you want to wrap your arms around, but all of them had weight. None of their shows are the sort of shows you can just kick back and, 2 hours have passed, I'm done. They all were engaging. And so Rodgers and Hammerstein are the standard. In fact, Oscar Hammerstein was the teacher of Stephen Sondheim. And so Sondheim constantly talks about how it was Oscar Hammerstein who really got him his start, really put him in the right direction, basically told him his first works were horrible. Go back, change this, try this. But these are the guys who really made the American musical what it is. So those two places that exist that people go and see theater. On this side is West End in London, and over here is New York's Broadway. Anything in the English-speaking world that's going to be successful has to find its way to one of these areas sooner or later, whether it be play or musical. But they are not the only place that is going to have theater occur. Theater goes in a lot of places. In Britain, they have an advantage in that they have what are called the national theaters. And in London, they have the National Theatre. What is a national theater? I got time also. What is a national theater? Don't be shy. What is a national theater? We're about to cross 3 minutes waiting for an answer. It's not really a society. You're in the ballpark, but you're like at the gate. Theater that represents a nation. That's, if you combine the two, we're there. National theaters are theaters that represent certain governments, countries, cultures. They're theaters that represent, that society. National theaters are huge in some places, and really what the privileges of those theaters is that those theaters are subsidized traditionally, which means what? I wish I could understand a word. They receive government funding. They're subsidized. If they put on a show and that show is unsuccessful, they don't close down the next day and tell everybody, we're sorry we didn't make it. We'll do better next time we get one going. If they have a failure, well, okay, this show didn't make a lot of money, but there's money that comes in from the government, so the place doesn't shut down. It just moves on to the next show. Without the subsidy, every show you have to put on has to somehow make some form of profit. But with government subsidy, if you put on an average show sometimes and, the audiences don't catch on to it, you're going to be okay. In Britain, national theaters are a very big deal. And in London, they have of their top, funded theaters, one is actually called the National. It started after the war, and it's still with us today. The only thing on that entire slide is that top one. The National Theatre in London got started in 1947. That's when the Parliament in Britain said, hey, we're going to sponsor this stuff and get it going. So here was what got that underway. During World War II, Britain suffered mightily. They were suffering what was known as the Blitz. Basically, their cities were being bombed on a daily basis. Civilians were targeted. The idea was if you could break the will of the civilians, you would break the will of the government, and thus, you would force them into, signing a peace accord. Well, Britain had to keep its cities functioning because its cities were where they were making armaments, where they were making cars, where their businesses were that, were keeping the war effort possible. And so during the war, Britain began to sponsor entertainments. They started funding movies. They started funding theater. They started funding things because if they didn't, everything was going to shut down. Nobody wants to stay in a city that's being bombed on a daily basis and have nothing to do. And so the government was funding all this basically to keep morale up, to keep the morale up. Well, after the war was over with, a lot of people were like, well, this is over with. We can now cut the funding on this and start putting it in other places. But people started looking around saying, hold up. This is Britain, the home of Shakespeare. This is where Shaw premiered and Oscar Wilde premiered their shows. Theater is a vital part of this country. We should be sponsoring it. And so after the war effort, they began the national theaters. And national theaters, basically were centered in London. But then somebody pointed out, hey, the tax dollars that are paying for this theater come from everywhere. And so then they started opening national theaters in other parts of the country. And so today, if you go overseas and end up in Britain, you've got National Theatre of Scotland, National Theatre of Wales, the Abbey Theatre is the National Theatre of Ireland. National theaters can be found in a lot of places, and it exists because, those countries believe that their arts are culturally enriching and should be supported by the government. This is what they send off to other countries. When theaters here, have the Moscow Ballet perform, that Moscow Ballet came here not because they knew they'd make a fortune in America. They came here because Russia sponsors them so people can see what they have. It's basically countries showing off what their arts are. And so in other countries, they actually have ministers of culture. If we had one, it would be called a Secretary of the Arts. But their minister of cultures are basically people who promote the arts within the country and then show to other countries what they do. And so it's a pretty prestigious thing overall. But national theaters really take hold after the Second World War. And so governments really have to start ponying up the money to making it happen, and they do that. Now, where is the National Theater of the United States? I just gave you guys a long explanation of their importance, so where is it? It's actually a really good throw out there. It makes sense to put it there. There actually is a theater located in Washington, D.C. called the National, but that's just the name of it, just like the name of the ball team's the Nationals. It's not the national baseball team, and it's not really a national theater, it's just the name of it. So where do we have our national theater? New York City? Well, that's the center of theater for the United States. You have more theaters per block than any other part of the country. But no. The National Theater of the United States is in the same place as the National Theater of Saudi Arabia. We don't have one. There are no national theaters in the U.S. Because if we had national theaters, they'd be subsidized. And when was the last time that the government subsidized theater? The Great Depression. the Federal Theater Project. We banned doing anything like that in 1940. So we have no national theater in the United States, which is one of the reasons that shows in this country have to succeed. If they don't succeed, it falls apart really fast. Nothing happens if it doesn't work. Now, that doesn't mean there is no arts funding in the United States, and some theaters can actually get some of that funding. But that doesn't mean they're employed or sponsored by the U.S. government. This is made through grants. And our largest grant institution for the arts is the National Endowment for the Arts, the NEA. That is where we find government help for creating and supporting the arts. Now, the NEA did not start until the 1960s. And so when you look at it through the perspective of all these other nations after World War II, were really fast jumping on saying, hey, this is part of who we are. When we finally got around to it in the 1960s, we were very slow to get into it, and we were very tight on the budget with it. We do not have just tons of money flying out for the arts. Arts are a very small part, and the National Endowment's always under the threat of being canned. The National Endowment of the Arts, basically any individual or organization in America can apply for a grant, and a committee looks over the proposal, and if they think it's worthwhile and that it represents, this is, an American artist trying to do something that's going to do this, this, and this, they can actually fund you. And so they can send money and say, hey, good luck with it. Some theaters apply to it saying, hey, we're working on this new work, but our theater is a historic theater and we can't redo this part without this much funding, and maybe they'll get some funding for it from the National Endowment. Some individual artists apply and say, listen, I'm working on this piece, but the only place that I can get the supplies for it is this place in Asia, and so I need to go to Asia for 6 months to do some research on it, and they may come up with the funding and help you out. It is extremely difficult to get a grant. It's just there's so many people who apply for them. There's such limited funding. It does not happen easily. But everyone in here has seen something that has been promoted by the National Endowment of the Arts. The National Endowment of the Arts funds a lot of education and arts programs. The National Endowment of the Arts, sends funding to National Public Radio, the station you flip through very quickly trying to get to something else. But all those items retain something from the National Endowment of the Arts. If you've ever seen any of these characters, all of these characters were possible because of the National Endowment of the Arts. This is why PBS has those drives about 2 weeks, 3 weeks a year, where they're like, oh, we really need your donations, because the National Endowment just gives them enough to survive. So if things go well, they'll do okay, but they still need more funding. But the National Endowment steps in there and says, hey, we're going to get you started, and the rest will be up to you. So all of these characters, would not exist without the National Endowment. They'd have been gone a long time ago if they had even started. So as of 2018, when we take a look across the board, this doesn't even come to $1 billion. And so if somebody says, well, that much funding in the arts, how much money are we talking about here? When the National Endowment for the Arts became a government program, it was under LBJ. When it passed, it had a budget about $155 million. And when you broke that down, it came to about 1 cent per person per year. So when you paid your taxes every year, 1 cent of your total earnings for that year went toward the arts in the United States. So, 1 cent of whatever you made that year funds it. At the height of the National Endowment's powers, it was making right around 68 cents per American. So every year, 68 cents. That was in the early 90s. In the early 90s, it went under a lot of attacks, and today we pay about 47 cents a year in taxes to support the National Endowment of the Arts. And so if you go to a fast food restaurant and look at the receipt afterwards, you paid more in taxes for that fast food meal than you pay for arts in this country. Now, I'm not saying that's right or wrong. There are two valid sides to the argument. Should we be investing money in this? Shouldn't we be using the money for other things that are more dire and more needed? Those are all legitimate arguments. But the argument of it costs too much, that's a hard argument to sell to me, considering it's less than 50 cents a year per person. And so, that's what creates this budget that we have now. And so, as I said, it's constantly under fire. Every day, we have somebody go up there and they say, if we get rid of this, we can sponsor this, this, and this. The money can be used better for this. I think it was Saturday Night Live had a great skit once where Big Bird was talking about how, he could end up on the street with Oscar. And he didn't want to be there. He needed help. And so I thought it was highly effective. Now in Britain, because of the national theaters, almost everything has some government money going to it. And this is where we find an interesting question that both the British and we have had to explore. In the 1960s, Edward Bond's Saved premiered in Britain. In the 60s, Britain had incredibly high unemployment. People were able to go to university, but when they finished, there was no job waiting for them after. You had people that were trying to enter a upper class system that had a rigid class system and didn't want them. And so Saved is really about people angry about the system they live in, and they just reject everything. And so in the play Saved, you have a bunch of guys in the park, and they come upon a baby pram, a stroller. And they grab it and they run off with it, and so, okay, now they have a baby. So now what? Well, they're hanging out, they're talking, and all of a sudden they start picking up bricks and cobblestones, and they stone the baby inside of it. Horrific play. Had people freaking out in the audience, people screaming and everything else. Okay, it was a shocking play. It was also a play that had been funded by the national theaters. And so when the British Parliament was like, wait, we paid for what? Where did our money go again? What did they do with the money that we sent them? How was that spent? They had a slight heart attack over this stuff, as you can imagine. And so in Britain, it actually went to Parliament, and there was a big argument. If a government is paying for the art, shouldn't it have a say in what is created? Can the government come in and say, hey, this is what we want you to create with this? And so we'll get to the answer to that soon. In the United States, the National Endowment, as I said, it started at 1 cent per person, and it got up to, 68, 67 cents. And then things really turned around. And the things that turned around were tied to this individual, Robert Mapplethorpe. In the 1990s, Mapplethorpe was dead by then, but he was a photographer and visual artist, and he had a show called The Perfect Moment. And The Perfect Moment was a touring exhibition that had been paid for with help from the National Endowment of the Arts. Well, when this show made it to Cincinnati, the curator was arrested for obscenity. I will say right now, if you want to investigate Mr. Mapplethorpe's work, go for it. You just put it into a search engine and have a ball. But I will also warn you ahead of time that in the early 90s and late 80s, his work was considered very controversial. It wasn't what you saw normally on somebody's refrigerator being held up with a magnet. That wasn't who Robert Mapplethorpe was. So in the 1990s, a lot of members of Congress became infuriated that the National Endowment had sponsored his work. A lot of artists came to his defense and talked about how Mapplethorpe was such a major figure They were attacking him now because he was dead and he couldn't defend his own work. A lot of galleries that individuals were arrested, yes, they did win their cases, but they still lost a fortune, and a lot of them didn't make it. And so his name became synonymous with stay away from this sort of work if you want sponsorship. And so the Parliament in Britain and the U.S. Congress got together, on their own, not together, and they had to figure out, well, what's going to happen with this. And on both sides, we had different conclusions. In Britain, it was decided that the Parliament can sponsor theater or it cannot sponsor theater, but it cannot dictate what a theater does. And so, they can pull the funding from theaters, but they can't pull the funding from the theater that put on Saved unless they want to pull it from everyone. Now, the reason that the Parliament did this is out of fear of creating what happened with the Federal Theater Project in the U.S., which was what problems did the U.S. Congress have with the Federal Theater Project? Spent a lot of time reviewing it. Say it. Political. If Parliament can tell a theater, if you put on this, we're going to pull your funding, they're a step away from then telling a theater, we want you to put on this because we need this to pass in the government. We want you to put on this because it'll look bad for our political opponents. We need you to do this because this bill has to have public support, and we know people will support it if you support it. And so a lot of governments are very weary of trying to dictate what's being performed, because before you know it, you're giving orders of, we need you to perform this, this, and this, and it no longer becomes theater as much as it becomes propaganda. Now, in the United States, we reached a different conclusion. The National Endowment of the Arts is allowed to pull funding from an artist if it feels that that artist's work is not representative of the American people. And so the question becomes, well, is what Robert Mapplethorpe, what he was doing, does that represent the majority of Americans? Do Americans want to pay for this sort of stuff to be created? And so if you're working on something like that and all of a sudden they come in and see it and they're like, this is not what we wanted, they can pull the funding from it. Which is one of the reasons that the only safe things for the National Endowment are Blue's Clues, Sesame Street, things that people aren't going to walk in and say, oh my God, you're showing people how to count, we're going to pull funding. And so they have to go out of their way to choose safer things. Ken Burns, one of my favorite documentary filmmakers, he gets a fortune from the National Endowment of the Arts every year, but he makes films about like the national parks. These are not exactly films that people are going to show up and say, well, I don't like the way you presented, Yosemite. You really got to change your tune on that one. And so we have two different answers to it. In Britain, they continue to sponsor their theater. They still have their national theaters, but they can't go in there and tell people what they can and cannot do. Saved, by the way, still gets produced. The last time it was produced, I think I saw the review said it's not nearly as shocking anymore in a world that has all the things we have today. But when it came out, it was that, play that, got Parliament together going, okay, we got to do something. Robert Mapplethorpe, his work still is found all over museums in the United States and in galleries for sale. Some of his works, sell for like $300,000. So it's not as if it's going to derail him. He's been gone a long time. It's not like he has a stake in the game anymore. But in the U.S., if the National Endowment feels that your work is not representing what they thought they were funding, they can pull that funding. And in Britain, all they can do is grind their teeth and say, okay, because they also want to continue sponsoring like the National Shakespeare Conservatory, the National Theatre of London, the National Theatre of Scotland, and all these other places. And so that should take us, to the last section we're going to cover, and that is Broadway. As I said, that is the big goal that everybody's reaching for. But Broadway is an incredibly expensive endeavor. It costs a fortune to get a show up on Broadway, and then that show has to make a fortune just to stay there. Well, as a result, safer and safer choices are made. And by safer, you're looking for stuff that will sell tickets and also not alienate members of the audience. You want as many people coming in as possible as many times, because Broadway is really for tourists more than anything else today. Tourists make up a huge portion of the Broadway audience. Well, because of the expense of putting things on, and because Broadway generally has safer audiences, a movement was started in the 1950s and really started to take off in the early 60s called Off-Broadway. And Off-Broadway were theaters that were not located directly on Broadway, but sometimes just like a couple of blocks away, sometimes just half a block away. And they were much smaller theaters. These weren't theaters that you could put, almost 15,000 people. These were theaters that are about the size of this one. They seat between 200 and 400 people. And Off-Broadway became highly successful because, one, you weren't dealing with as many unions. When you had a Broadway show, you had to deal with the box office union, the valet union. You had to deal with every tech union. You had to deal with equity on all things. Off-Broadway, some's unionized, some's not unionized. But with the smaller theaters and everything else, it's just not worth trying to get everybody to charge a fortune for what they do. And so Off-Broadway became the new place where you would go to see something like, Who's Afraid of Virginia Woolf? It would never open on Broadway today. It would have opened off-Broadway. And if it was good, they'd have moved it on to Broadway eventually. Now, unfortunately, and I just told you this one, what happens to off-Broadway is, instead of it becoming the alternative, it becomes a testing ground. And so now you have a show that you really think, hey, I think this can make it, but we don't have enough money to open on Broadway. We're going to open off-Broadway. And if it's successful off-Broadway, we'll try and transition it with more funding. And so as a result, though, all the advantages of working off-Broadway, the savings on expense and everything, well, that started ticking up as bigger and bigger producers started producing things off-Broadway. Also, some shows that opened on Broadway and were hits critically and won a bunch of awards, well, they weren't shows that were going to constantly bring in a big audience. And so what happens is a lot of those shows then move off Broadway after they've had that initial run and people have seen it, and it's like, oh, that's great. And they'll move off Broadway, and they'll last off Broadway for years. They'll run for a long time because they can fill a 200-seat house every night. They can't fill, 15,000 seats a night. That's what The Lion King is for. That one's going to fill the bigger houses. And so off-Broadway, in many ways, started to suffer the same problems Broadway did. So then there was another movement. This is just to show you the different size theaters from a Broadway to an off-Broadway. And that other movement was the off-Broadway. Yeah, I know, they got real creative with the names. Off-Broadway is as far as you can go and still be part of that New York theater scene. Cafe Sino is often seen as the birthplace of off-Broadway, and it was an actual cafe that in the evenings turned into a theater. And so it could only seat about 100 people. But off-Broadway, you did not have to deal with nearly any of the technical problems or union problems that were going to come into trying to produce theater. And you were going to be able to put on shows that they would never put on Broadway because they wouldn't make money. They were considered important shows, but they weren't considered, shows that people were going to fork over $200 to sit down and see. You can still see an off-Broadway show for under $50. And they are great shows. And you can still see an off-Broadway show for under $50. We actually took a class to New York a couple of years ago, and we all got off-Broadway tickets to see the same show, and nobody paid more than $25. If we had decided, hey, we're going to all see the same Broadway show, it would have cost us about $160 a ticket. And so Broadway is really that tourist destination now where people go, and it's like, well, we've been saving up so we could do this, whereas off-Broadway and off-Broadway are still places that you can go and say, well, we just want to see the show. We're interested in seeing a show. We're not interested in, going to Disneyland for a day, which is what Broadway has become in many ways, because Disney is the largest producer you're going to find there. When you take a look at these theaters here, this is what Cafe Sino looked like when it was opening, especially with the AC unit sticking out the side. It was not a luxurious event in any way, shape, or form, but people were going in and producing theater that still continues today. And so, outside of the New York theater scene, we do have some reputable, good theaters. They are called regional theaters. Regional theaters are unionized theaters outside of New York. Unionized theaters outside of New York City are regional theaters. In fact, one of the more famous regional theaters is actually in this state. Somebody tell me what the regional theater is in the state of Alabama. You're killing me, people. You're killing me. And it's really early to die. It's a professional theater located in the state capital. Well, the capital city. What? It's the Alabama Shakespeare Festival. The Alabama Shakespeare Festival is a regional theater. When you go see a show there, that's what those actors do for a living. This isn't where they're racing off to in the evening when they're done with their day job. The directors who work there, that's their job to work there. It's unionized. This is a professional year-round running theater. Regional theaters have some of the best performers you're going to find in any area. A lot of people who are performing at ASF, they're going to move over to Atlanta the moment they get a job offer to move to the regional theaters there, which would be Actors Express or the Alliance Theater. And a lot of people try and use regional theater to get to New York finally. Some people just move to New York trying to make it. Some people try working their way up. Regional theaters, if I use a sports analogy, it's your AAA. It's that one step below where you want to be, trying to make it over. You can see theater anywhere with community theaters, college theaters, theaters exist. But as far as seeing professionals perform, regional theaters are basically all you're going to find in the United States as far as people making a living performing. All right, folks, let me call them and let's get out of here.